Hello, and welcome everyone to the meeting to discuss innovation, shortening the path to commercialization in advanced therapies. Thank you very much for attending. My name is Clare Sarvary Fourrier. I'm Senior Vice President of Operational Strategy for Precision for Medicine. I joined Precision in 2016, and I come from a clinical research, clinical operations background, and I've had a particular focus in innovative research in oncology, including immune oncology and cell therapies. I'd like to thank ARM for inviting us to Meeting on the Med and Precision Advance for hosting this panel discussion. This topic is near and dear to our hearts at Precision. Since 2013, Precision's interdisciplinary teams, including Precision for Medicine, Project Pharma, and Precision Value and Health, have been working closely with our clients to develop clinical, manufacturing, and commercialization solutions to help these advanced therapies advance through regulatory and approval commercialization and access so that they can really realize their potential to transform patient lives. Having been a partner to over 80 advanced therapy organizations, we know that delivering in cell and gene therapy to market requires a comprehensive and integrated approach. Therefore, we're proud to introduce Precision Advance, a suite of interconnected services and complementary teams working through early clinical through to access and uniquely focusing on the complexities to successfully bring advanced therapies through to market. We have a fantastic team on the panel of experts today to share their perspectives on these innovative technologies and their strategies and experience in shortening the time to market for advanced therapies. So I'd like to provide a short introduction to each of the panelists. Joining us today, we have Alex Grosvenor. Thank you, Alex. Problem with the pronunciation of your name. So Alex Grosvenor, thank you. Alex is Senior Vice President of PRECISIONadvisors, where he leads the EU arm of the global pricing, market access, pricing and analytics practice. Alex brings more than 10 years of consulting experience in biopharmaceutical industry, 7 of these in pricing and market access. Alex has worked extensively in the areas of oncology, biosimilar, cardiovascular, CNS, HIV, multiple sclerosis, and ophthalmology, including providing guidance in advanced therapies. Anshul Mangal. Anshul is the president of Project Pharma and Precision Advance. Anshul founded and grew Precision Pharma into a leading global biologics and advanced therapy engineering consulting firm, pioneering the industrialization of advanced therapies, including 2 notable commercially approved cell and gene therapies, and created Project Pharma Advanced Therapy Manufacturing Playbook to help develop the largest cell and gene therapy footprint in the world. Dave Lennon. Dave is president of Novartis Gene Therapies, leading the research, development, manufacturing, commercialization of Novartis's AAV-based gene therapy pipeline, including the scale-up of Zolgensma, the first gene therapy approved by the FDA for the treatment of spinal muscular atrophy, which also received NICE approval in the UK this month. Parag Meswani. Parag is Chief Commercial Officer at Therapies, a clinical stage company focused on developing gene therapies to radically improve the lives of patients with neurodegenerative diseases. Parag has served in various commercial and medical affairs leadership roles at Novartis, Pharma, Biogen, and most recently as head of Luxturna's commercialization at Spark Therapeutics. Pascal Tuchong. Pascal is president and CEO of Atara Bio. Pascal has over 30 years in global biopharmaceutical leadership experience. After having led Novartis's global efforts in the CAR-T, including the approved and launch of Kymriah, the first ever CAR-T approved in the US, he currently leads Atara Bio, a leading off-the-shelf allogeneic T-cell immunotherapy company developing novel treatments for patients with cancer, autoimmune, and viral diseases. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating, and we very much appreciate what you can bring in terms of expertise to this discussion. So, the pharmaceutical industry's drug development pipeline is growing exponentially, in part due to the changes that have allowed the emerging gene and cell therapy companies in their pipeline. As we've heard from ARM in recent reports, there are upwards of 1,100 advanced medicines in clinical trials worldwide. Many of these companies are in early phase clinical development. Everyone on this panel has been invited to speak because of their specific experience contributing to the advancement of cell and gene therapies. I'd like to start by identifying some of the challenges that our industry is facing when bringing a drug from the commercial setting to commercialization. Dave, if I could start with you. With Novartis being one of the few companies in the world with a commercialized gene therapy, in your opinion, what are the key opportunities to apply lessons learned when planning going through from the clinical setting to the commercialization of an advanced therapy?
Sure. Well, thank you, Claire. Thank you for the opportunity to be on the panel today. Really excited to be here to have this discussion. Actually, yes, Novartis is one of the places where we've commercialized not just gene therapy, but also cell therapies. And we have a pretty extensive experience now in the early days of commercialization. I think when we think about that transition from the clinic into the marketplace, there are really three things that come to mind based on the experience we've had launching Kymriah in the cell therapy space and Zolgensma in the gene therapy space. Three areas are, I think, first and foremost, manufacturing. How do we get the scale and continuous production necessary to generate and satisfy the demand that will be in the marketplace? The second is then the ability to gain access to these therapies and the readiness of payer and healthcare systems to deal with a one-time therapy and its introduction into the conditions under which it's going to treat. And the third area is really then the logistics and commercial supply chain that's necessary to allow these medicines to reach patients quickly. I think when we think about the manufacturing, it's really important to recognize that when we're going from clinical scale to commercial scale, there's a huge transformation that an organization needs to go through. We're talking about, in clinical scale, often a few batches that we need to meet the demand of a clinical trial. But when we move into the manufacturing scale, we're thinking about global reach, we're thinking about continuous production and continuous supply of product. And we're thinking about advancements and changes that we're going to make to process for these advanced therapies. And often these therapies have not been scaled in the past. And so the first thing that we as innovators have to do is figure out how we're going to scale those technologies and satisfy global demand. On the commercialization side, our healthcare systems are set up for chronic conditions, and most advanced therapies are being approached as a one-time treatment. So that comes with the sticker shock of price that's usually associated with those therapies, but also the realities of the transformational benefit that they bring to patients who really have very high unmet needs and may not have other treatment options. So there's tremendous urgency from the community. There's a desire from the clinicians to utilize these therapies, but there's concern from the payers about the durability of the therapies, the ability to afford it, and the overall impact that they're going to have. And so those negotiations need to start early to be effective. And then finally, when we think about the commercialization aspect, there's just the reality that with advanced therapies, you're really thinking about just-in-time delivery. For cell therapies in particular, the customer is also the provider of the raw materials for manufacturing. And in many ways, it becomes a very much an intimate process between the manufacturer and the customer to make sure that we can deliver these therapies effectively on the time around the world in very short timeframes and with shelf lives that usually don't last very long. So those are some of the considerations and learnings we've had as we've brought these therapies to market, and really there are opportunities to create new paradigms with our customers in terms of how we recognize the value of these therapies, but also satisfy patient needs.
Thanks, Dave. And thanks for setting the scene for our discussion today. Pascal, if I could turn to you, your previous experience of going from research to commercialization, and then the current pipeline with Atara Bio, where you're in advanced discussions with the FDA on filing a BLA submission, what do you think are the key challenges, particularly with regard to on the regulatory front?
Thank you, Claire, first of all, for inviting me to this great panel with a lot of experts of the field. And it's together that we can advance the field. And it's good to be together again there with the help of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine there. Now, when we look at the current situation in these transformative therapies like Kymriah, like Zolgensma, but more in cell therapy like Kymriah or Tab-cel, Atara allogenic T-cell immunotherapy for PTLD, or even the most advanced TILs, these are not only breakthrough therapies that can really bring significant benefit to patients in need, but they are also what I would call first in kind. It means that when you consider manufacturing or control, it is the first time that the FDA is exposed to this kind of product. That's why I call them first in kind. And this is creating a significant level of challenge and discussion with the agencies, not only the FDA, but other agencies as well, related to what should be really the CMC part of the submission there. Because clearly from a clinical point of view, especially when you have breakthrough therapy designation or RMAT, you have a very important dialogue to optimize the type of studies you can make with these type of new therapies, cell therapies. I mean, we know that, for example, doing double-blind study, control study is very challenging with this type of therapies, but very often the regulatory agencies are well accustomed to be flexible from the clinical point of view in terms of putting together the right type of studies to prove efficacy and safety of these transformative therapies there. It's a bit more challenging on the CMC front, and it's not specific to Atara, is for all the companies. And I remember the time with Kim Raya, and I know my colleagues in other companies with Yescata and others had the same type of challenges on the CMC front. And again, this is because these are first in kind. And in a certain way, there is no precedent, there is no established critical criteria for this product. Are they all different? And the key expert of the product is very often the sponsor. And it requires a very close collaboration with the FDA or EMA and other regulatory agencies to understand together what will be the best type of key criteria to be the element of the release specification of the product, of the testing that is being done for that product, of the key element of the CMC file. So then there should be expedited access to these transformative therapies for patients, because we align with the FDA and others that what we want is to bring innovative therapies to patients, of course, in a controlled way, in a safe way, but these are very often life-saving drugs. And we need to bring that to the patient as fast as possible. Ultimately, what we believe that when we are back, like it's the case at Atara with Tab-cel, with very strong clinical data, the sponsor being the one that should really work with the FDA to align on what are the critical criteria. I remember a couple of years ago when Peter Marks and the then commissioner of the FDA put together this idea of critical criteria for manufacturing of these cell and gene therapies. This is really what is at core there, is to have a collaborative and a fast type of collaboration, fast in terms of getting to a conclusion there, collaboration with the FDA and EMA and other regulatory bodies to make sure that we clearly align on what are these critical criteria that needs to be controlled. And once you have a robust manufacturing process and the ability to control these key criteria in an acceptable way, that's where you can really consider a final submission there based on strong clinical data. So clearly, a lot of progress has been made on the clinical part, but there is still a lot of collaboration needed and constructive and collaborative mindset with the regulatory agencies on the CMC and manufacturing part.
Thank you, Pascal, for those insights. Parag, if I could turn to you, what lessons have you learned from your career at Spark Therapeutics and now at SciBio Gene Therapies in preparing for commercialization?
And thanks to the panel, to the meeting organizers for inviting me to participate. I'm fortunate to have had the privilege of leading the US commercialization and launch for Luxturna. And when Luxturna was approved back in 2017, there was a fundamental question regarding how to ultimately get this innovation, this breakthrough into the hands of physicians and their patients, a question that I think takes a lot of different dimensions. As this panel, and as many of you can attest to, the complexity of bringing cell and gene therapies to the market forces you to rethink how you did things in the past. That's just the way that business gets done. And as Pascal said, there are no silver bullets. I don't think there's any established best practices, but I think we as a field are getting smarter and getting smarter in rapid fashion. So for us at SciBio, and I think my guidance for companies that are developing and looking to reduce the complexity of commercialization, you have to ask a couple of fundamental questions. The first one to ask is why? Why should a physician prescribe your gene therapy? Why should a patient take that gene therapy? Why should a payer pay for that therapy? Basic questions, but fundamental questions that I think even more critical when you're talking about a potentially one-time delivery of a therapeutic. You got to have a thesis at minimum across all stages of the life cycle of these programs. And that to me starts with the question, why? The second that I think we've gotten smarter on, and Pascal has alluded to this already as well, which is we have clearer guidance from regulators on what it's going to take to develop and commercialize gene therapies. guidance that in some ways was lacking just a few short years ago, but now is here, it's tangible, and it gives us something to react to and something to strive for. It's a framework to help us evaluate manufacturing and CMC, clinical trial considerations, issues like study design and endpoint selection, right? What is approvable from a regulatory perspective, but what's meaningful to a patient? And I think we now have a chance to think about this in a much more collective manner, where you're factoring in what matters across all these different stakeholders to answer the why question across all the stakeholders. And the final piece I would say here is that we have to ask ourselves early in development, once again, are we confident in our knowledge of the patient journey and of the supply chain right up until the administration of the treatment to the patient? Companies that are launching cell and gene therapies should view the overall kind of value chain as a critical strategic concern that should be considered before the commencement of clinical trials. That's what we're trying to do here at SCIO very early on in clinical development, because it helps to support selection of trial sites, to drive patient identification initiatives, and later prioritization of treatment centers. And so, we try to conduct a detailed analysis of the end-to-end delivery of gene therapy at commercial scale, and think about that now in clinical development, and focus on how we're going to remove those barriers up until patient administration. For Luxturna, this was identified as a key imperative early in the program's lifecycle, leading to proactive efforts to engage treatment centers and centers of excellence, initiatives to drive patient identification and genetic testing, and to better navigate the patient journey. And it's a priority we've tried to embed in SCIO's gene therapy portfolio as we develop our own rare disease programs for lysosomal storage diseases.
Thanks, Parag. That leads nicely actually into the next topic I'd like to focus on, and that's manufacturing. Anshul, Project Pharma has pioneered the industrialization of cell and gene therapies, helping over 50 advanced therapy organizations with their manufacturing strategy and execution. What are the key challenges you have seen therapeutic developers face, specifically around manufacturing?
Thank you, Claire, and thank you to Arm for hosting us today as well. I think Dave kind of alluded to, the manufacturing challenge already, and the bottlenecks in manufacturing have been well documented. And the bottlenecks in manufacturing just aren't in actual capacity, but they're everywhere across the supply chain, from raw materials, long lead equipment, CDMO capacity. Personally, I think the most important bottleneck in manufacturing is a talent gap. And the gap's hard to quantify, but I think we can quantify the gap based on the growth and investment in advanced therapies. I think while the science in advanced therapies has been around for decades, the first cell and gene therapy was approved in 2017, and therefore advanced therapy have started to become industrialized over the past 4 to 5 years. As much of the data that we all recognize from ARM, there's over 1,000 clinical trials, half of them are in the US. There's over 1,000 therapeutic developers in the space, again, half of them in the US. And in 2020, there was a record-breaking year in the amount of investment that was put in the advanced therapy space. And in the climate that we were in 2020, that gives you the sort of confidence level that the investment community and financial institutions have in advanced therapies. Therefore, to now take these therapies and start to move them from a clinical to a commercial setting is going to require just a much greater workforce than we currently have, to ensure that the demand is met and ensure that these drugs and life-changing therapies are being able to be received by the patient and the families that need it the most. So again, I think really the talent gap is the one that we all need to address. Would love to hear about that from Pascal and Dave as they've scaled up their organizations. How they've kind of helped address some of that talent gap.
Thanks, Anshul. Pascal, Atara Bio has moved from academic partner manufacturing to Atara Bio's purpose-built facility. Could you share any insights into the manufacturing planning, including the talent preparation and for the therapies as you move through from the clinical research and prepare for commercialization?
No, thank you for your question. What we are now, we are in phase 3 and we are going to file a BLA this year according to our plans. So what we did is that initially Tab-cel of most advanced product was developed by an academic partner, Memorial Sloan Kettering, that was manufacturing the product in their own facility. And they are great manufacturers there. They follow GMP and so on. but they are more into kind of phase 1 type of manufacturing, which is different from what then the FDA is really asking for an approved product. And therefore, it means that not only you need to transfer the technology, and what we did first to a CDMO, and now we do it also in our Atara site in Southern California. But it's not only about transferring the technology, it's about making it more robust, upscaling it, and making it at a level that will be required by the FDA or EMA to get a product approved. So there is this dual action that is around transferring the technology, but in fact, integrating the technology into a system that is really ready for the approval stage and pre-commercialization and commercialization. And right now, for example, last year, we did all our PPQs and all our activities there with a process that is fully controlled, that we know very well, that is inspired by the initial process, but it's not exactly the same as the initial process. Now, once you do that, you need to scale up, and you need to be able to have something that is not only controlled in a way that you can confirm and guarantee the level of efficacy and safety you've seen in your pivotal trial for the commercialization stage, but at the same time, you need to make sure that you have a level of efficiency in your manufacturing yield, if I may say, especially for allogeneic cell therapy, which is really one of the key advantages of allogeneic cell therapy, that is scale up enough so you can have a lower cost of goods and be able then to ensure access for patients in a proper way there. So that's really what is at stake there. On the other hand, you are, as I was saying earlier, defining with the regulatory agencies what are these critical criteria that really you need to control when you change slightly your manufacturing process. And the debate with regulatory agencies have been about minor changes or major changes of manufacturing process. And when it is a minor change, I think the FDA and others starts to accept the idea that you don't need to do a new clinical study because you have element of comparability within other type of studies, usually in vitro there, that allows you to guarantee that the minor changes are leading to a comparable product. And then you can really leverage your pivotal studies, whether sometimes some may have major changes that are changing the product to a level where you might need to do some bridging studies there. So that's really this ability to scale up and ideally not to do major changes. So you can scale up and leverage the studies that have been done by the academic partner as supportive data, as well as, of course, your pivotal study and your pre-commercialization stage. Now, coming to the point that Anshul raised, that is a very important point about talent. It is true that there is kind of bottleneck right now in terms of talent in that space because there are so many companies there. And we believe there are two types of talent there. There are the talents that are really there at the beginning when you start to move into manufacturing, when you start to do your IND, and that's a very different type of talent than the talent you need and the team you need when you want to have a fully controlled, robust process that could be submitted to the agencies and approved there. And very often in many organizations, you separate the talent, you have different teams doing different things there because it's not exactly the same thing and the same type of creativity and ability to have a very reproducible type of process and ability to manufacture this type of transformative therapy, depending where you are in that chain of value creation, whether you are into the IND phase where you want to go with a safe product in a clinic to try new things, or whether you are in this late stage where you need to control and scale up at a different level there. There are a lot of challenges on talent, but I believe now the industry is developing so fast that people are having an accelerated path to excellence, if I may say, because you see people that have gone through different things over the period of 2 to 3 years. So they are like experts in other fields that have 10 years experience. And that's fine. Sometimes when you have been exposed to so many challenges and so many opportunities over a short period of time, you are really an expert in that in very new nascent field.
Pascal,
thanks very much, Pascal.
One follow-up question I had for you was, what kind of manufacturing challenges have you faced in developing allogeneic therapies, versus, most of the field that's currently developing autologous therapies?
There are two types of challenges that are, one is specific to all allogeneic cell therapy. The other one is specific to allogeneic cell therapies that relies upon healthy donors. Okay, I'll start with the latter one. In fact, when you rely upon healthy donors, and many allogeneic cell therapy are relying upon healthy donors, you need to have a clear supply chain, not only from accessing the cells from healthy donors, but really knowing exactly what you are accessing and what you want to access to. So for example, we established a partnership with Be The Match, which is arguably the largest organization from a transplant point of view. And they have such a database that we can really know which donor we want to see in our supply chain. And there are some donors that are very important at the beginning. And then you need to have a clear profile of that type of donor from an HLA type in particular, to be able then to find similar donors, to be able to have the right type of starting material in terms of the PMBC coming from these healthy donors. So it's really how you manage your supply chain and how you know enough about the type of donors you want to see, especially from HLA type, that then you can really build a very strong, robust, and continuous supply chain in this type of allogenic cell therapy. The other aspect for allogenic is to make sure that you have the ability to scale up the process to really deliver on the promises of allogenic, which is easy access, low cost of goods, and better control, because you can really control the starting material in a way that is not possible with autologous cell therapy there. So this is really some specific challenges that are across all type of allogenic cell therapy, is how you manage this aspect of managing the starting material, scaling up, and really in a way that maintain the profile of the cells that you want to see in a clinic, not only from the point of view of the key criteria I was mentioning, but also other aspects like the phenotype of the cells, or the ability of these cells to really expand, traffic, and kill the tumor cells in a proper way there. So there are these are probably the two key aspects on allogenic cell therapy that are very different in terms of manufacturing challenges. But as we can see, what we and others are doing, these are achievable. And we are now in this late stage situation where we believe that we have a proper control of the starting material, of the manufacturing process, and a proper scale-up that make this product really at the pre-commercial and hopefully soon commercial stage.
Thank you, Pascal. Very interesting to hear about the connection with Be The Match and seeing these levels of experience and expertise come together actually to facilitate that type of approach. Thank you. Dave, if I could come to you, would you be able to share on the manufacturing aspect of Novartis taking therapies into post-commercialization and scaling up globally? Have you seen particular aspects that may have been unexpected as you break this new ground? And what solutions has Novartis put in place to address these?
Sure. So thanks for the question. I think a couple areas I would highlight when we think about post-approval commercialization globally. I mean, I think one is that as Pascal mentioned, and as we all know, that we often define the product as the process and talk about that, but that the components of critical design parameters and analytics parameters become key to managing the product over its life cycle and over many years. Because as your process evolves, as you introduce different sites into your process, you're trying to maintain consistency to your original file or to updates that you're making to your file with the agency. And so the components of talent that come together around your product characterization as it relates to analytics and the talent related to investigations becomes quite critical in your ability to manage consistency of product as you go around the world. The second component is that each approval introduces new demands from different regulators. And while you may work hard to negotiate sameness of product across different regions, that doesn't always occur, as there may be just requirements that local agencies demand for approval, which leads to the question of flavor management for your product over the course of globalization, which is really a key challenge when you have products that have somewhat limited supply and capacity constraints around production, and are also very expensive. And so therefore you don't want to hold inventory in particular different flavors dedicated to individual markets. And so that's the second component of challenge that exists. And those can come in different flavors, can come in different choices of raw material requirements or process changes or analytics components, or even things like localized testing, which comes up quite often when you're negotiating with different health authorities who would like to see some degree of the supply chain be incorporated into their local markets. So when you think about globalization, it really introduces, in a large effect, just the complexity of what this endeavor really entails. And while we tend to think about it as one product, it quickly can become many different types of products depending on the markets that you're entering into. And as now we're approved across 39 countries with Zolgensma as an example. We don't have as many flavors, but we do have a number that we're having to manage now in a global supply chain.
Thank you. So just to finish off this area of discussion, Anshul, could I just come to you and just ask you, what innovations do you see on the horizon in the area of manufacturing and that would allow greater patient access to cell and gene therapies?
Thank you, Claire. Yeah, there's been a ton of innovation in manufacturing over the past number of years. I think the emergence of single-use technologies, disposable technologies in advanced therapies has been critical, allowing for lower production costs, speed, timing, increase in productivity, simple disposal, reduced energy and water consumption, and just one of the major ones is reduced risk of cross-contamination. Now, they have their downsides as well, but I think the upside has greatly outweighed the downside, and they're still evolving to date. Bioprocessing systems have evolved significantly over the past few years. I think 5 or 6 years ago, when Novartis was commercializing its first ever gene and cell therapies and using the very first ever adhesion and suspension bioreactors, we certainly had a lot of challenges in integrating those in the manufacturing process, but they have come a long way, and now these same companies have rolled out 10+ upgrade releases for these systems. Better clean room infrastructure technology to allow for more flexible manufacturing facilities has been a big improvement in the space to allow the Ataras and Novartis of the world to be able to scale better and faster and reduce the time to market for these therapies. I think the innovation that still needs to happen more is innovation shifting from dedicated facilities to more multimodal facilities and providing innovation in the space to help with that shift paradigm. Obviously the manufacturers who are bringing these therapies to market have complex product pipelines and need the flexibility to develop different modalities in parallel. And as Dave just pointed out, different flavors potentially of the same modality in parallel. So I think having multimodal solutions will allow greater flexibility, scalability, and operational efficiency and speed to market. The other factor that's going to be critical over the next few years is just more automation, reducing human error and time to market, lowering production costs would all be welcomed, I think, by therapeutic developers. And I think for even more so for cell therapies, closed manufacturing systems, closing the manufacturing process as much as possible, reducing human interaction, will allow for a smaller manufacturing footprint and lowering costs of these life-changing therapies.
Thank you, Anshul. Before turning to some of the pricing and commercialization questions, I just wanted to ask a couple of questions about the clinical development aspect. Parag, if I could come to you first. You have experience in conducting clinical research that has specific demands on the site and for the patients, including the method of therapy administration. What are your thoughts in how to establish strong research engagement with the investigational sites and how to encourage patient enrollment as well as patient access to clinical research, especially in rare disease?
Yeah, that's right. That's a great question. As a reminder, at Spark for Luxturna, this is a treatment that was delivered directly to the eye as a subretinal procedure. So complex in and of itself, and was done at centers of excellence throughout the US and now globally. At SIO, we have a similar approach where we strive for product indication fit, where we intend to deliver the gene therapy to the target tissue with the appropriate administration. For instance, for one of our programs in GM1 gangliosidosis, we are delivering the gene therapy systemically, IV. Because we're looking for spread across the entire body. By contrast, we have 2 other programs, one in Tay-Sachs disease and one in Parkinson's disease, that are being delivered directly to the CNS. And so it requires a little bit of a different thinking as to how you're going to engage with your sites and what the overall patient experience is going to be. So as we think about establishing strong research engagement with sites, with investigators, and with the broader patient community, we have to think about the market structure, the landscape of treating these diseases as it stands today, and whether that structure can support the development and introduction of an advanced therapy, similar to the ones that we're all trying to develop here. And so for these types of programs that do have a degree of complexity, what we try to do is trace the treatment journey and understand every stakeholder, every touch point along the way in the delivery of our treatment. I think, as I was mentioned earlier, companies that are commercializing cell and gene therapies need to think about the delivery of a product, but more than just a product. Adopt a mindset of delivering a treatment that is holistic and that thinks about stakeholders that are involved in the administration and post-delivery care in a holistic manner. And we think that this enables companies to engage with identified stakeholders early to better understand what are the potential barriers and then identify solutions. And the solutions involve offering a service beyond just a therapeutic, beyond just drug discovery. At Luxturna, and also for what we do here, these include things like site certification and training of medical personnel, helping patients and patient organizations identify treatment centers, identify centers of excellence, navigate the treatment process itself, which is really unique and can be quite cumbersome in certain circumstances, and support it and enable it in a robust enough way. And so companies need to plan and invest early to be able to offer these services and have to start thinking differently about market development forces and factors like this. Particularly the need to expand outreach and educational activities beyond the usual stakeholders. And so these are things that we think about even right now for Parkinson's disease, where we have a program in the setting of a disease that already has a very complex treatment paradigm today, a disease that already has a very robust set of gene therapies and other modalities in the research pipeline. And so we have to challenge ourselves now to better understand the treatment paradigm and how the introduction of a gene therapy for Parkinson's disease in the future can address and tackle some of the challenges that we see in the marketplace today.
Thanks, Parag. Dave, what are your thoughts about working on advanced therapies in rare disease and how to consider the global enrollment opportunities?
Yeah, I think we have to recognize that a lot of rare diseases don't know bounds, but at the same time, so there's a lot of specificity that can be generated as you look at opportunities with rare diseases. I think on the first point is, what are the demographics and epidemiology? What's the genetic? Often these diseases are genetic in nature, and so there can be specific opportunities in different parts of the world for these conditions and therefore these therapies. And so, often we're thinking about how do we tailor our approach for the epidemiology that's expressed. The second piece is that often these patients then accumulate in a few centers where there's expertise in treatment. And so we need to be able to go to those centers. Now, they may not be clinical trial centers. They may not have experience with advanced therapies, and therefore there's often an education and support model that's needed. And then finally, we need to be flexible about what we do, because often there are country-specific requirements to run advanced therapy clinical trials. And often these can be quite time-consuming to overcome when you think about GMO considerations in certain markets, et cetera, for these kind of therapies. When you think about DNA testing, there's limitations around privacy, et cetera, that can occur. And so often we have to also be flexible to think about bringing patients to centers. And so often you'll see in the cases of rare diseases and advanced therapies, patients traveling from country to country for the purposes of enrolling clinical trials, which means that you need to then tailor your follow-up strategy in the clinical trial operations to make sure that you can capture and follow those patients wherever they may fly to ultimately and live, given that we often need to also have long-term follow-up with these patients. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the considerations when we think about clinical trial. In globalization, I think a lot of the effort has been centered in the US so far, and there really is an opportunity to enroll patients faster and to get broader access if we include a multi-country approach to advanced therapy development in the future.
Thank you. Pascal, Atara Bio is developing allogeneic cell therapies, as we've mentioned before, in a number of indications. Will that simpler study logistics that are associated with allogeneic cell therapies allow a wider profile of sites to participate in clinical research, including a global aspect of the types of site that could participate in that type of cell therapy?
Yes, indeed. I think we have now experience in delivering our allogeneic cell therapy to clinical site across the globe. We are working in 3 continents. We have sites in Australia, in Europe, in the US, in Canada. And we're able to deliver this therapy within just a few days, usually 3 days in the US and sometimes 4 days in Australia because you have a traveling time there. So that allows very easy logistic from that point of view. So the logistic is simplified by allogeneic cell therapy, logistic and supply, because you order like a biologic. You order it, you get it a few days later. It's not at the pharmacy, but it's at the level of our inventory in California, and we can ship that very fast. Even during COVID-19 pandemic and even the more dramatic time last year, we were able to deliver within a few days to patients across these 3 continents. So that's a testimony to the allogeneic cell therapy type of supply chain and delivery, and our team at Atara, that we've been able to deliver without missing any patients during that pandemic time. Now, this being said, the ability to expand the clinical site beyond very specialized transplant site is not only linked with the allogeneic cell therapy per se, it's also linked to the type of treatment and monitoring you need for these patients. The good thing with our most advanced treatment, be it tab-cel in PTLD or be it ATA188 in progressive MS, that they don't require a pre-treatment. It's just a 5 to 10 minutes IV infusion, and you just need to monitor the patient for 2 hours. So it's really like a traditional biologic. And our vision in the future is to have this allogeneic cell therapy being used like a traditional biologic. Of course, they have to be deep frozen and thawed, but apart from that, it should be really like a traditional biologic in terms of the ability to use that in outpatient clinic or in different site than the typical cell lab or transplant site or hematology lab there. And the great experience we've had, like in MS, is very interesting there because neurologists are very traditional in their habit of treating patients in many aspects. And I think Dave knows that well as from his point of view. But in reality, when they're proposed with such a safe and potentially transformative therapy, they are ready to adapt. And when the way to adapt is not that complex, because it's, as I say, just like using a monoclonal antibody in many aspects, then they easily adapt to it. So that's really pushing the frontier of that space to go beyond typical hematology transplant sites that are doing transplant and stem cell transplant every day into a different type of healthcare practitioners and physicians there, like neurologists, who are then getting used to have cell therapy there in clinical trials and hopefully one day in their practice to treat many, many patients. So that ability of allogeneic cell therapy to be available in a simple way for physicians and to be able to get as close as possible to the patients, depending on the type of disease that we are considering, is extremely important. And we believe it's the future of the field, is really to go in this simplicity of supply, delivery, and use of allogeneic cell therapy.
Thank you, Pascal. And just before leaving this topic, Parag, I wanted to ask you, obviously a lot of these therapies are single administration therapies, but another side of it is that the cell and gene therapies require sometimes extended patient follow-up periods and also post-commercialization studies also to gain additional data. What are your insights into how these requirements impact the research community?
Yeah, it's an important question, and the impact is real. The impact is real on patients. It's real from a regulatory perspective, and it's real from a patient perspective. So, I think a wholesale understanding of the patient population and their individual physical and emotional journey through diagnosis and treatment is essential, and it's essential across the different stages of drug development. In clinical development, it involves including the patient voice early on in the process and the design of the trial. In treatment considerations and outcome selection, and understanding the burden of illness and the requisite patient support that's going to be required along the way. Pre-treatment, there's active engagement with patients and caregivers that informs how you communicate with them, how you communicate with the patient community and with physicians. That's part of the decision-making process. And post-treatment involves deep, early, and continuous patient insight to help shape the sustained long-term follow-up that's going to be required by regulators and by payers to monitor the long-term outcomes and ultimately the value of the approach. As we all know, the regulatory role doesn't end once a product is on the market. That's obvious. They have to continue to monitor safety. There's continued passive surveillance with patients and physicians providing their own reporting. There's active surveillance. There's review and required phase 4 studies that are conducted by some companies. So the regulations are starting to present a real challenge in gene therapy over time. And if advanced therapies fulfill their promise to meaningfully modulate or even eradicate disease, the patients that are feeling better may prefer to disengage from the fact that they've even had a condition. And so how do you maintain that connectivity and keep them as active members of a gene therapy or a disease community and capture that critical long-term data? That could be challenging. And so solutions need to be considered, and they need to be frictionless and innovative in the way they're deployed to maintain patient engagement and maintain that access to the data and to the connectivity of that data to longer term outcomes. And so effective long-term outcomes monitoring solutions need to be built in with the patient mindset at the center, and making sure that they're activated, that they're bought in to the process, that they understand the expectations around it, and that you enable the right tools and communications to capture that data over the longer term.
Thanks, Parag. Definitely agree that as we see these studies building up as they go through their development pipelines, this is going to accumulate and impact the sites quite a lot, as you say, in the patients. Thank you. So thank you, everybody. I'd just like to focus a couple of questions on the very important area of pricing and market access for these innovative therapies. McKinsey noted in a recent report that amid breakthroughs in gene editing, the pharma industry must recalibrate its development and reimbursement model for these advanced treatments. So Alex, be great to hear from you. As these innovative treatments enter the marketplace, what challenges are you seeing specifically related to pricing and market access?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. I mean, I think Dave touched on this at the very outset of our discussion today. And I think the main point here is that gene therapies or cell and gene therapies are very different from conventional chronic treatments. And for that reason, some of the existing models that we have for assessing the value and then pricing and reimbursing these treatments is in some cases not quite fit for purpose. And so there has been already, I think, we've seen empirically some adaptation from the different pricing and reimbursement authorities around the world to accommodate these new treatments. But that is an ongoing evolution. I think one thing that's important to think about is just why or how and why gene therapies are different. So there are two or three things here. The first, I think, to really stress is the evidence. So it's not unusual for any drug treatment to come to market with data that doesn't necessarily characterize the long-term outcomes of that treatment. But we are talking here about, in many instances, transformational treatments, potentially curative treatments. And we're seeing products come to market with much more limited evidence packages, clinical trials with small patient numbers, with surrogate endpoints, and really that longer term value of the treatments isn't always as well established at the time of launch. And that creates issues for payers when they're looking to assess the value. So the value proposition of a product at launch isn't necessarily reflective of its true long-term value. And so that creates uncertainty, which also then creates issues around how you assign a price to a product. The next point, I think, is to do with the cost. And again, this is something that we've touched upon. Dave mentioned this at the beginning of the discussion. You're talking about products here, very sophisticated treatments with very high costs of goods, high price expectations. And when these are given as one and done treatments, single administrations, all of that cost is in the upfront administration of the treatment, unlike chronic therapies where the cost is spread over the course of the treatment duration. And I think the third point is maybe to do with the actual administration of the treatments as well. Again, these are highly sophisticated, innovative treatments that require highly specialized administration in specialist centers. And that, I think, potentially causes some funding and local access issues. I think for the most part, we're seeing quite a lot of progress and resolution around some of those early questions. when some of these therapies were first being developed. I think also just empirically with some of the assessments that we've seen to date, we're still in the early days, of course, but we're seeing that the HTA bodies, for example, in Europe are recognizing the value of these treatments. So where there is a very high unmet need, they are kind of seeing through the limitations of the clinical evidence, relying on the very strong efficacy signals, and translating and recognizing the value that these treatments bring. So far, we've seen lots of positive decisions. And I think where we're going is going to be interesting, because we're going to be expanding into more common diseases where some of the affordability, budget impact, and evidence requirements may differ. So it's very much a case of watch this space.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I saw that the Clare approval was definitely certainly going to impact in terms of pricing. Pascal, could I come to you? What do you think the place is here for the use of, in terms of evidence, as Alex just mentioned, in terms of real world data or synthetic comparator arms or other methods to support the evidence provision in cell and gene therapy?
Yeah, I believe they are very important in the sense that you get your cell therapy approved on the basis very often of an open study. That's the case for Kymriah, for all the others, and hopefully will be the case for Tab-cel, for Atara, which means that you are there and you demonstrate to the regulators that you have a very high level of response and a significant enough duration of response. And that's the two key criteria when you address an unmet medical need, which are considered by most regulators as sufficient to get an approval. Then, of course, when you go to the payers, they will see with different eyes and they say, okay, but this is relatively short term, you don't have a comparator. What tells us that this is really something that cannot be achieved with something else? So there is a lot of debate about that, but we believe that having very strong real world data, first having data from what's happening in these patients today with the standard of care, because even though, especially in oncology, you may not have any product approved, there is still a standard of care because physicians are trying the most they can to solve the issues with their patients and to save their lives. So there is different type of regimen and protocol being used. So once you have very good identification based on strong data on what's happening in the current situation with these patients, and you can really compare the patients that are treating in the real world with the patient you have in your study, that's where you can convince the payers that you are bringing really a significant benefit on top of what's existing today. But that relies on the quality of your real world evidence. And then, of course, you have to follow the real world evidence of your product. And recently, Kymriah presented great data from UPenn about the 5 years follow-up that shows that these patients that were responding after 1 month or 3 months, many of them are still responding 5 years down the line. And that's the promise of this type of transformational therapy, be it cell or gene therapy. It's a long term. And you know when you discuss with payers, they want to make some modeling about the benefit of your therapy. And one of the key debate is about which assumption should you take about the long term when you don't have long-term data. You may have 6 months, you have 1 year, that's it, usually. And they want to model at 5 years what's happening, and some of them even at 10 years. So for these assumptions to come true, you need to have this real world data progressively demonstrating that the initial assumptions about the 5-year benefit or 10-year benefit are real. And you can really deliver long-term value for the healthcare system, for the patient, for society with this type of therapies because you have this real world data. So that's the two aspects, real world at the beginning to know exactly what's happening to this patient, not only, by the way, in terms of health aspect, but also in economic aspect. And we've done several studies, for example, ourselves in PTLD to show the cost of this type of post-transplant lymphoma that is very important for society. So when you have a good idea of what's happening today in terms of the healthcare aspect, as well as the cost of these patients' situations, that's helping you at the beginning. And then to be able to have long-term follow-up of the patients, to have real-world data to confirm to the payers that the promise you made at the beginning about long-term impact is real and is going to deliver value to the healthcare system. That's very important. Now, to the virtual group, this is really related to the ability to best identify the patients and to be able, hopefully one day, to have comparison that will be accepted by regulatory authorities between a virtual group that is exactly the same kind of patients in real life versus your treatment, because it's very challenging, especially for cell therapy, to do placebo-controlled study. In fact, we are doing one. We may be one of the first company to do one in MS, in progressive multiple sclerosis, because in that particular space, we need for the regulators, they cannot accept an open study. They want to see a difference versus placebo. So we've been able to make and to start a study, a randomized controlled trial of AT188, or transformational therapy for progressive MS that has the potential to reverse the progression of the disease versus placebo. So we'll have the results, some early results next year, but that's very exciting to have this placebo-controlled study. But this is not possible in most situations, particularly in oncology.
Thank you, Pascal. Very interesting insights. Thank you. Dave, what implementation challenges is the industry facing with regard to the value-based agreements? Has the approach shifted at all regarding these agreements in the past few years that you've seen?
Well, I mean, I think it is shifting and it's developing. I think, you know, when we think about value-based agreements and the approaches that we take to support the value discussions that I think Parag and Pascal described well, which is, you know, how do we get aligned around the unmet need and what the value creation opportunity is, and then how do we provide the evidence for that? Building on that, we then need to put structures in place that enable that value to be realized, dependent on the system requirements that exist in a particular market. And this means that we need to first partner flexibly with each healthcare system for the enablement of access for patients. And often this comes in basically addressing the concerns they have around either lack of data or their particular population needs. When we did this with Zolgensma, we approached very flexibly what we called our day one access program, which is that we didn't want any patient to get delayed of treatment because we couldn't sign an access agreement with a country. And in doing that, we provided a couple things. I think the first is that we made sure that we agreed that countries could start to treat patients, and we would retroactively apply any agreements that we had to the very first patient we treat, so that we didn't have time in negotiations holding up patient treatment. The second thing is that most payers now want to see outcomes-based agreements. To Pascal said, the promise of this therapy is this long-term durability, and therefore payers want to make sure that if they're going to pay money up front, that they actually get that money back if patients don't achieve the outcomes that we're promising. And then the third important area is really thinking about how does it fit in the overall budget for a particular country. Many payers think in an annual budget cycle, and we need to make sure that we're not disturbing that. So we think about annuity-based payments or spreading payments over time, even though we might treat upfront. And a lot of this comes down to the fact that we have the flexibility for the first time to guarantee compliance. And it's a luxury that we have with one-time therapies that doesn't exist with chronic therapies. And therefore, we can actually structure agreements that take advantage of 100% patient compliance in a way that others can't. I think the second aspect is then really helping healthcare systems accumulate that value effectively within their patient population. And this means we need to invest, I think, upfront in patient identification and referral. And so getting patients through the system as early as possible so that they get treatment and can get the most benefit out of treatment early in their journey. And this in genetic disease often comes in the form of newborn screening or genetic screening for patient populations that allows identification before symptoms and therefore better outcomes for patients if they're treated early. And then on the back end, it's making sure that we have the care support around the treatment. Most patients will not walk away the day of their treatment and be fine. They need to actually continue to be managed, and actually putting in best-in-class support services around therapeutic intervention, but also around physical interventions and other support interventions for their patients and their families is critical to make sure that we can overcome the challenges with the application of these therapies.
Thanks very much, Dave. Parag, what are your thoughts relating to the reimbursement models and how to anticipate this affecting across single administration treatments in rare disease versus more prevalent diseases? You mentioned that earlier in one of your answers, just earlier in the discussion. How should companies prepare to engage the health systems and payers to shift the paradigm?
It's a great question. It's one that that we think about pretty often. A lot of good insights have already been shared. I think I'll add a couple more areas that at least keep me up and that we try to think about pretty often. I think broad strokes, companies have to continue to identify innovative mechanisms to quantify and demonstrate value in gene therapy to the system over the long term. That's clear. I think it's been well said already. But the question is, how do you engage with payers to uncover ways to incorporate these into your value story? And I think there's a different burden of proof that's emerging between rare disease gene therapies and therapies that are being developed for more prevalent conditions like MS, similar to what Pascal's team is working on or what we're working on here in Parkinson's disease. And that keeps me up. It's something that we have to continue to think about because a lot of focus has been applied towards the existing experiences on the market, which are pretty limited right now between Luxturna and Zolgensma and Kymriah and some of the other CAR Ts that are out there. And so we're still kind of learning as we go. So, I think we have to continue to kind of assess what are the differences in the burden of proof required between rare and prevalent conditions and how do you develop and commercialize and get payers to pay for them. And I think the second piece is, are there regional differences? Are there differences in how that'll be addressed within the US and within Europe and beyond with respect to evidence requirements? I think there are probably some commonalities across both from a rare and prevalent condition perspective, which is a deep appreciation of the burden, prevalence, and impact of the disease on patient communities. Essential, best understood through understanding the lens of the patient to get a sense of the impact of the disease on their lives. Socioeconomic impact of a rare disease is obviously critical. The actual cost of managing a disease and being able to quantify that, I think is probably more easily done on the prevalent condition side than on the rare disease side, arguably, depending on the indication. I think all these collectively will build a narrative that will inform physician understanding and payer understanding and can ultimately be incorporated into HTA submissions and economic models that support the value dossier. I think crucially, in the absence of data, the absence of literature to augment limited data platforms, bringing in that patient perspective that provides high value real world evidence to illustrate need to patients and payers and physicians and to help build momentum in commercializing the therapy is key. And I think those are probably consistent across rare and prevalent. I think where you're starting to see some divergences perhaps are in how the US and European markets kind of evaluate gene therapies moving forward and the evidence requirements that are going to be requisite across the board. So clinical evidence package, I think there's a pretty stringent bar across the US and Europe with respect to the follow-up required and endpoints that are being selected. I think lack of clear demonstration of efficacy in more prevalent indications, I think could be a deal breaker. Maybe not so for rare diseases, right? TBD. I think the HEOR package in the US, I think this is becoming more and more important. In the EU, it's been important. And so supporting your evidence package with market-specific guidelines in Europe, I think is going to be vital. Understand the payer mix. And the US has a very clear delineation of payer mix, and that informs how you think about your strategy on the market access side. In Europe, it's probably more of a regional or locally driven process. And again, I think that's probably consistent for rare and for prevalent indications. And then payment models. We've talked a little bit about this between Pascal and Dave. I think we're still figuring this out. I think there's just so much interest, collective interest across stakeholders to begin to define alternative payment models to ensure that this innovation ultimately reaches patients. I think we're still in the early days of this. And I think in Europe, in some ways, it's a bit more of a standardized part of the process and having value-based agreements. I think in the US, there's a lot of really good dialogue. I think starting to see some of that dialogue translate into action in reality, but I still think we're in the early days of that process, and we're seeing leaders that are already out there begin to shape their narrative. But I think there is an element that's going to be tailored based on disease, and disease size may indicate some of these considerations in the future as well.
Thanks very much, Parag. Very interesting. Because of time, I'm just going to ask one more question, and Alex, I'm going to direct it to you. We don't have a lot of time left, so I just wanted to sneak this one in. How early, and it's a little bit addressing what Parag raised there, how early in the drug development life cycle should evidence-based data such as health economic data be considered? Why is that such a crucial step in the commercialization of advanced therapies compared to other therapies?
Yeah, I mean, our advice is always it's never too early to start getting involved and gathering this sort of data. I think it's foundational for any company developing any asset to characterize the market that they're going into, to understand the nature of the problem they're trying to solve for, to understand, really what's already there. So I think, we've touched, Parag was just talking about many of the aspects already there, but it's, and we've talked about some of the topics already in some of the other discussions, but it's fundamental really to understand the epidemiology of the disease, the burden of the illness, the natural history, the current treatment practices. All of this information is foundational to understanding the opportunity but also what the evidence requirements are. And that, I think other things like real world evidence and health economic models can be important for informing the sorts of parameters and the evidence thresholds that you need to hit, not just with the clinical trials, but also informing any gaps in your evidence that that different stakeholders in the market will be looking to understand. So it's multifaceted, and I think, especially when we're talking about rare diseases where these diseases are often not very well understood, not very well characterized, and certainly not well understood from a payer perspective, that a lot of this information gathering and analysis is essential for all of the downstream development and commercialization, especially when it comes to HTAs and submissions and those kinds of activities.
Thank you, Alex. Dave, Anshul, Parag, Alex, Pascal, thank you all very, very much for your participation in the discussion. I'd like to thank you for bringing your expertise and experience. It's been very interesting talking to you. I'd also like to thank ARM and Meeting at the Bed for hosting the conference, and Precision Advance for inviting me to moderate this panel. Finally, if you'd like to discuss any of the opportunities further, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of the panelists here. We have a downloadable resource that will be available on the Precision Advance booth with contact information and more information on Precision Advance. Thank you very much.
Well,